Average net worth by age told me I was behind, and 3 years after I started trying to close that gap, my net worth was $126,000 lower than where it would have been if I had changed nothing. I had searched average net worth by age to find out whether I was ahead or behind, then rebuilt my investment strategy around the answer. At 48, I had increased my retirement contributions, invested more of every paycheck, and still ended up further behind. 3 years earlier, my net worth was $472,000. Most of it sat in a 401k, a taxable brokerage account invested in broad market index funds and cash reserves that covered several months of expenses. I had no plan to change the allocation until I searched average net worth by age and compared my balance with the figures for households in my age bracket. The average was much higher than $472,000. I recalculated my net worth twice, adding the retirement account, brokerage balance, checking, savings, and the value of everything I owned before subtracting every liability. The result barely moved, and the gap between my number and the average still looked large enough to represent years of missed progress. My retirement account held $286,000. The taxable brokerage account held $128,000, and cash and other assets accounted for most of the rest. I had been contributing enough to receive the full employer match while automatically buying broad market funds in both accounts. Nothing in those balances suggested a financial problem until I placed them beside the average net worth for my age. I increased my 401k contribution on the next payroll cycle. The higher contribution reduced my take-home pay, so I cut discretionary spending and increased the automatic transfer into the taxable brokerage account from $1,200 a month to $2,000. By the end of the first quarter, more than $3,000 from each month was moving into investments before I made any other optional purchase. The change worked exactly as expected. New contributions entered both accounts every month, the market moved higher, and my net worth crossed $500,000 sooner than the pace I had projected under the old contribution schedule. Instead of reducing the importance of the comparison, crossing $500,000 made me check the average net worth by age figures again. The gap was still there. My balance had increased, but I had started measuring progress against a number that did not move with my own savings rate, salary, or investment plan. I stopped asking whether my net worth was growing at a reasonable pace and started calculating how quickly it would need to grow to reach the average before I entered the next age bracket. At my existing contribution rate, the answer was too slow. Even if I continued investing more than $3,000 a month and earned the return I had used in my projections, the portfolio would need years to close the difference. I increased the taxable transfer again, redirected most of my annual bonus into the brokerage account, and reduced the cash balance I had previously kept untouched. By the end of that year, my net worth had climbed again. On paper, every decision looked like progress toward the average net worth by age benchmark that had started the changes. Then I ran the projection one more time. Even after the higher contributions, the bonus investment, and the additional cash I had moved into the market, the projected gap was still measured in years. Saving more had increased my net worth, but it had not solved the problem I had decided the average represented. That was when the strategy changed. I stopped looking only at how much money I could add and started looking at how much return the existing portfolio would need to produce. The broad market funds were no longer enough for the timetable I had built around average net worth by age. I stopped directing new brokerage contributions into the total market fund and moved them into a large cap growth index that had outperformed it over the previous several years. I left the 401k unchanged at first, which made the shift look limited to money I was already willing to invest more aggressively. My brokerage balance rose enough that the difference showed clearly beside the broad market position still sitting in the retirement account, and every new contribution widened that difference. When my net worth passed $540,000, I increased the monthly brokerage transfer again, instead of restoring the cash I had moved out earlier. I then sold part of the broad market position in the taxable account and added the proceeds to the growth fund. That changed the brokerage account from a diversified portfolio receiving aggressive contributions into a portfolio increasingly dependent on one part of the market continuing to outperform. My net worth kept rising, so the concentration showed up as a higher balance before it showed up as higher risk. The next time I checked average net worth by age, the gap had narrowed more in 6 months than it had during the previous year. I calculated where the account could be by 49 if the recent return continued and found that the benchmark no longer looked several years away. For the first time since I had started comparing myself with the average, catching it looked possible without waiting for another major increase in salary. That changed what I did with the 401k. I replaced part of the broad market allocation with the growth option available inside the plan and directed future contributions there as well. The retirement account and brokerage account still appeared separate on my statements, but a growing share of both was now tied to many of the same large companies. The overlap produced exactly the result I wanted, while those holdings continued rising. My annual bonus arrived while the growth allocation was still ahead. Instead of dividing it between investments and cash as I had done before, I transferred almost all of the after-tax amount into the brokerage account and bought more of the same fund. The cash reserve that had once covered several months of expenses fell again, but my invested assets reached their highest level. By the middle of the second year, my net worth had crossed $600,000. I was contributing more, holding less cash, and carrying substantially more exposure to the part of the market that had produced the strongest gains since I changed the strategy. Average net worth by age had started as a comparison, but it was now determining how much I invested, where I invested it, and how much diversification I was willing to give up. I went back to the source behind the average net worth by age figures because I needed to know whether I had actually been ahead or behind when this started. This time, I opened the underlying tables instead of stopping at the headline average. The median for my age group was nowhere near the number I had spent 2 years trying to catch. The median was dramatically lower than the average. A relatively small number of very wealthy households pulled the average upward, while the midpoint of the same group sat far below the figure I had spent 2 years trying to reach. My original $472,000 had placed me much closer to the center of the distribution than the average had ever suggested. I checked the definition again because the difference was too large to ignore. The dataset counted retirement accounts, taxable investments, bank balances, real estate equity, business ownership, and other assets before subtracting liabilities, and the age bracket covered households at very different stages of accumulation. I had converted one descriptive statistic into a deadline for my own portfolio. I rebuilt the comparison using my balance from the day I first searched average net worth by age. Then I placed the median, the average, and my $472,000 on the same page. The financial gap that had triggered every change since then looked completely different once the average was no longer the only number on the screen. That changed what I checked next. Instead of projecting how quickly the portfolio could reach the benchmark, I measured what had happened to the portfolio itself since I started chasing it. The allocation changes had left the taxable account and 401k holding many of the same large growth companies through different funds. I pulled the holdings from both accounts and combined them. Positions that looked moderate inside each account became much larger when I treated the portfolio as one balance, and several of the companies I thought I owned through separate strategies appeared near the top of both funds. The diversification I had seen on 2 account statements was much smaller when I measured the underlying exposure. I then rebuilt the portfolio I would have owned if I had kept the original broad market allocation and simply made the larger contributions. That version had not grown as quickly during the strongest months, but the difference in ending value was much smaller than the difference in concentration. Most of the progress I had credited to the new strategy had come from contributing more money, not from taking more risk. I stopped directing new brokerage contributions into the growth fund and restored the 401k contribution allocation to the broader option. The first statement after I stopped buying the growth fund showed how little of the risk I had actually removed. The largest positions in the taxable account were falling faster than the broad market, while several of the same companies were still pulling down the 401k. I had changed where the next dollar would go, but hundreds of thousands of dollars were still sitting in the allocation I no longer wanted. The taxable account dropped more than $30,000 before I finished the first round of sales. I sold enough shares to begin rebuilding cash, checked the account again after settlement, and found the remaining position lower than it had been when I placed the order. Money I had pulled out of cash to accelerate my net worth was now coming back out of the market at lower prices. Inside the 401k, I moved the remaining growth allocation back into the broad market option, leaving the retirement balance below the projection I had rejected 2 years earlier. The faster portfolio had reached the same point as the slower one, with more of the downside already absorbed. The taxable account could not be reset as cleanly. Older lots still carried gains, while several of the later purchases were below their cost basis. My actual net worth was $558,000. The same money, contributed on the same dates and left in the original allocation, was worth approximately $684,000. I pulled up the first projection I had made when $500,000 still looked too far below the average for my age. That version had assumed I would keep buying broad market funds, maintain the cash reserve, and allow the portfolio to compound at the slower pace I had decided was unacceptable. 3 years earlier, average net worth by age had given me a simple answer to whether I was ahead or behind. Now I had $558,000, less cash than I started with, and a net worth that would have been worth roughly $684,000 if I had never tried to catch the average. I closed the comparison with both balances still on the screen.